him. So my name is Staša Milojević, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Information and Library Science in the School of Informatics and Computing. My research is in the general area of science, so I'm really interested in understanding how contemporary science functions and works, and some of the major properties of science in terms of themes, intellectual content, development of disciplines, and so on. So today I wanted to share some of the more recent research that I have been doing, which is combining the understanding of the intellectual diversity of disciplines and the research teams in terms of what is the role of the research teams of different sizes to the intellectual diversity of science. It really goes back to one of the earliest science of science findings, which is the exponential growth of science. It's like it was the Sola Price who found this really interesting graph where he said, like, science grows exponentially. Like, there are more and more scientists. Like, soon every man, child, and dog will be a scientist, and there are more papers than you can read. And if you look at some of the fields, such as astronomy, you can see that exponential growth if you just count the number of journal articles. So in the 1960s, there usually was 1 paper per day, and now you have around 20 papers per day. But then the question is this really the way science grows, right? So is this really the best representation of growth of science? If each of these units, which is each of these papers, really brings new knowledge, so I guess our textbooks should have really changed, right? Or you can say, well, but there was a diversification in science, right? There are more disciplines, but then we can say, well, are there now 1,000 departments in universities, or the number of departments is more or less the same? Are our curricula getting, like, do we require now students to have 100 classes versus approximately the same number? So I think actually using just the raw number of papers to understand the growth of science probably is not the best measure to understand how science grows. What would be a better approximation? And again, any measure is an approximation, and it measures only one aspect of science. So yes, paper production tells us something, number of scientists tell us something, but then if the science is usually equated to knowledge, I was thinking, well, what aspect of a document can tell us something more about knowledge itself? And one thing that came up were actually concepts, or different concepts that one can find in documents. Of course, ideally, you can say, well, you want a full text of a document, you want to see everything the document is about, and there are some problems with that. If you want to do longitudinal studies, full text for most of the articles is still not available. Abstracts are a better approximation of what these papers are about. However, we run into the same problem, which is that abstracts become widely available only since 1990s onward, and even then you don't have them for all of the fields. So what's left, actually, what every single paper has, are titles. And titles are really interesting, and I know people often say, well, but you cannot count on titles. People try to be funny, they are witty, they really do not represent the content. And that may be so, and some of the titles are witty, and some of the titles may really not present the content. But we have to keep in mind that now there are 20 papers coming out every day in astronomy today. Are you going to be only witty, or are you going to put in the titles tags that would tell people what the article is about so that they may actually read it, right? Because the problem here is the attention economy. We don't have that much time. When we find results back, we usually look at the titles first, and then go on to abstract, and then we go on to the full text. So really, this idea of titles as attention triggers is really tied to authors tagging, in a way, their papers with relevant words or concepts so that other people can really find them later on. Titles also have really undergone a big change throughout the 20th century. They did become more informative, so people did realize that you need to provide more information for people to really look at what you are presenting. They also have become more specific, right? So really generic titles are not as frequently found anymore. And they also contain a larger number of words that indicate article content. And of course, like any given article article title captures concepts only crudely. When you have millions of them, you may try and start seeing some patterns that are meaningful. And this is exactly what I try to utilize in order to understand the cognitive extent of the fields. So the idea really is to count the number of unique phrases in titles and normalize for the unequal volume of literature. Because if I wanted to do only a snapshot of the intellectual extent of a particular field, that wouldn't be a problem, right? I just take what's this here, it's a static picture, I can count the phrases and I get the image. But I was really interested in the evolution of science. But then there is a problem. There are more papers and the titles are becoming longer, which means that there are chances of encountering new unique phrases are getting higher, right? Because there is just a larger volume of new words. So if you want to do the longitudinal comparison, you have to normalize so that you can compare. And one way to normalize is really to identify, to cut everything into the unique number of phrases, which was around 10,000, or every 1,000 articles, you would actually then look for what you're getting in terms of the intellectual content. The cognitive extent, actually, or what I'm measuring with this measure, it's not related to the quality in any way. So I'm not saying there is really necessarily a deeper knowledge or this knowledge is more important qualitatively than the other. I'm really interested in covering the cognitive territory of a discipline, right? So I'm really interested in, because the more concepts, the more unique concepts you cover, the larger cognitive territory you do cover, right? So that's why this measure is the measure of, I call it the measure of cognitive extent. The way to do that, actually, again, there are millions of words, so you need some automatic way to identify phrases. I used two parameters. One was, oftentimes now there are punctuation marks. So actually, more titles are having subtitles and things that are usually, and they are divided by colon, and then you have dashes and you have stops, full stops, you have commas, and all of these are actually usually delimiters between the phrases because I'm interested in identifying the phrases. I also found that the general words are good separators of phrases. So I used the dictionaries of general words, and I also studied the words in samples of the articles to come up with a longer list of those general words. And they're usually prepositions, articles, and some of the non-specific words. And the way the system then works is in this title, which is Halos and Voids in Multi-Fractal Model of Cosmic Structure, the phrases I would identify would be halos, voids, multifractal model, and cosmic structure, right? So these would be the phrases that I would identify. And you can see similar things here where I would have collision strengths, then electron impact excitation, then fine structure levels, and then Fe13. So these would be separate phrases. This method is actually really powerful because I'm not counting only words. I'm really capturing also novel interactions among the existing words. So if you look at the words such as mass and energy, those would be unique concepts in the papers prior to relativity theory. However, after the relativity theory, we have a new phrase, which is mass-energy equivalence, which I would capture because I'm capturing phrases, not only single words. So the unique concepts are really then the range from like 1 to n number of different words that not only capture just words, but really interaction of the existing concepts that become novel concepts in and of themselves. And actually to test this, that mass energy equivalence, I tested and it occurs only in relativity theory papers. So you do not find it in other papers in the astronomy. So the data I used to do the empirical study of this was like in 3 fields. I did astronomy, physics, and biomedicine. Over 100 years for astronomy and physics and like 60 years for biomedicine. And this is the evolution of the cognitive extent of astronomy. And here you can see what I've been telling you, that I've been sampling every 1,000 papers. So you can see that in early periods, like 1,000 papers is the only thing you can have, like in a year or 2 year period. And then here we start having like multiple iterations. every 1,000 papers are randomly sampled from all of the papers in that time year period. And although I'm having multiple samples and they are random, you can see that actually there are some trends. There is not a wide dispersion around the line here when you do the normalization for every 2 years. So here is so instead of thinking of astronomy developing like this, right, where we have exponential growth, it actually was more like this, which is still a growth, but the growth is actually more linear. It's not exponential. And what happens here, you can see some external events. So actually astronomy prior to the late 19th century was astronomy, and then once it became astrophysics, there were new methods, and it really expanded the cognitive content, right, because the new methods allowed for new things. After the Second World War, it accelerated the speed, so it expanded a bit more. And then since the Sputnik era, it was continuously expanding. And you can see also that the rates of expansion are changing, but this is really not tied to the raw productivity because the productivity is kept constant here, right? So these are just the concepts that you have. One can then apply these measures to different units, right? I showed you what happens in astronomy as a whole, but you can look at individual journals and see what is the cognitive extent of a journal. And again, for the and this is not the quality of the journal. This can just tell you, are these journals more general, or do they have a more focused coverage? You can actually do that for countries as well. So you can actually see, again, this is normalized for the volume of production. So it doesn't say, still, the United States produced most papers, but we want to see, are these papers only on 2 topics, or do they cover a wider array of topics? And you can see, actually, that while China, which is here, is actually accelerating, it still covers only a subset of topics in astronomy, right? So yes, like the presence is getting there, but you cannot say, well, China is overtaking. Well, yes, it's catching up, but not necessarily in all of the areas of astronomy. They still need to cover, like they still need more people probably and more expansion to cover different topics. Now I'll move to what I said I'm going to do, which is connect this cognitive development to the teams. And teams actually have become another staple of modern science. And whenever you hear that science is developing, you can say, well, science is team effort. Teams are really bringing the biggest innovations. Teams are really responsible for novel combination of ideas, and teams are growing in sizes. So in the paper that I recently did, I wanted to model the development or the evolution in teams in science. And while big teams are really becoming more important, the picture is not as simple, because actually we still have really significant efforts by single authors and pairs of authors, even in the fields such as astronomy and physics. So here is astronomy and there is physics. You can see that there's a similar pattern. It's just a 20-year shift when these things occur. So even nowadays, in the fields that are best known for big science, we still have significant contributions by individuals and small teams. So in that model that I proposed, there was a way to analytically identify the team sizes, actually in terms of whether they are core teams, like these are the small teams, or whether they are core plus 1, which is, I can talk a bit more, but this is like more advisor-student pairs, and then those really large extended teams. So I wanted to combine this classification of teams to the cognitive extent to understand how, in particular disciplines, what is the contribution of teams to the cognitive extent. And again, if you read, big science seems to be trumping little science on all fronts. So like even if you read editorials in science, we say, we need these big teams to solve all of our problems, like big teams of the future. Big teams are something that we definitely need, and we do, and they do have their place. However, if we focus funding only on those large teams, would the science done by small teams die? And if it does, what are the possible effects, right? What is the contribution of these small teams? What you can see actually is that in astronomy, individual authors and author pairs cover the largest cognitive territory. So if these people are no longer able to do science, what would that do? Like if we have just big teams, well, we can do great science, but only in a subset of the teams that we did before. So I think actually in order to keep the science ecology healthy, I think that there should be some drivers in place that would still support work by maybe individuals and smaller teams. Things are actually similar in physics, although not necessarily the single authors. Well, single authors and author pairs and core teams are still covering the largest cognitive territory there. And you can see that the really large teams are covering small territory, and actually it's like their contribution is dwindling, actually. I mean, I'm not saying that the quality of what they contribute is less, but it's really not covering all of the physics that there is. There is more of the physics than high energy physics, which is what's done here. Things in biomedicine are somewhat different, actually. Although really large teams, again, are covering less of a territory than the others. But what's really different from astronomy and physics is the contribution by single authors and author pairs. The major contribution there are core teams. And this can tell us something more, and I haven't explored it in more detail, but one can actually see by using this measure, you can identify fields that have a stronger theoretical component to them versus the ones that do not, because both astronomy and physics have strong theoretical components to them. And if you are doing theory, in theory, you can do it on your own, right? You don't have to have large teams. And you can do theoretical work in pretty much any field in astronomy, like any subfield or sub-area in astronomy, which is true in physics. Well, biomedicine is fairly applied field. I mean, it's really empirical field, obviously, for which you need labs. The moment you need a lab, well, you need at least one other person to run the lab. I mean, it's rare that you would have a single lab-run facility nowadays. You need even one student to do that. And you can see that. So here, right, where the role of the individual, especially individuals, has diminished, which means that they probably cannot do a lot on their own. So this was pretty much like what I've shown you here in terms of the combining the teams and the cognitive extent was some of the more recent work that I did in combining the two. So like if you have any suggestions on other things that I can look at in terms of combining this or any suggestions for interpretation, I'm looking forward to hearing them. So thank you. Yes.
I have two questions actually. So this idea that you're looking at the cognitive expense of the various concepts that are being generated by a whole research agenda project. Do you think it has to do, there is this idea that in science usually either you follow the herd and you do what everyone is doing because it's easier, or you go for a riskier path and you try to explore. Do you think it maps into either of those options?
Well, actually, because this method, in a way, captures every single unique term. So if you manage to publish a less popular thread, in a way, and use in the title the words that capture that, this method would capture it. Of course, we need to keep in mind that I'm measuring only things in title, which means that the things, when they start appearing in titles, have usually been vetted somewhere in the text. So, and it's known that in the natural sciences, actually, this process of codification of meaning is much faster than in social sciences. So, and that would be another study, but one could look of the first appearance of the concept in the full text and how long does it take for it to be so codified that it becomes a norm in a title. So what this is showing, maybe, I think it's a valid picture, but I think it's probably, if you think of it as an image, it's probably one that has like a delay, right? So these have been, and again, codified terms. There might have been some that appeared, but nobody used them ever again, they would still be here, but they would be just one, like because there are 20 million articles, they would still have their place, but they probably, this measure is not so, like you can, like a few words or even like a few percentage of the total words cannot significantly shift the trends because of the number of terms that you're using.
And so the second part is, how do you think this idea of cognitive extent could measure how healthy a field is? Whether, like, if it is in the sense of Lagados, that like you want the degenerate field that become kind of stale, or rather the degenerate field will still produce new concepts, only that they're kind of self-referential.
So these are a few other studies that I have in mind. So the first one is, like, how does it relate to the health of the field? And I won't say to health, but actually there is a really interesting book called Academic Tribes and Territories that really says that all of the science can be divided more like villages and cities and towns. So like the cities, they cover a larger territory, but the more people live in them, so they move faster, right? So what I wanted to do with these things is actually see the cognitive territory and the number of people and the movement of the research front, right? Because, and other people such as Abbott, in the number of his books, have said that the main problem of social sciences are that they just keep adding new things that they study and never get rid of. Like, it's more like a cumulative effect. Like, you find new things and you just add them and you keep them, but you add new things. But the number of social scientists is more or less, I mean, it's growing, but not at the rate at which we are adding. So I think actually this, combined with some of these other measures, such as the number of scientists and maybe the movement of the research front, can actually, I think, show us some of the things that you're saying. Another would be maybe the rate of the dying, because this is just capturing, okay, these are the concepts that appear now, and one can follow how many of those concepts are actually repeated and what is the ratio, in other words, of the influx of new things and the continuation of the things, which is the theory. But like this was more of a introducing, because actually I worked on the method itself, I think, for 2.5 years. In terms of tweaking it, it wasn't that, I mean, the idea was there, but it wasn't that easy to actually come up with things that actually start making more sense and cover more things. Yeah. Yes, Colin.
So I'm interested in very interesting all of it, but in the data versus theory, what you're pointing to the very large team science. And I'm curious whether or not there's another variable here historically, which is change in authorship norms. And what I'm thinking in particular is if you took some very large government-funded project like Los Alamos, for instance, right, and looked at all the theory papers that came out of that, but considered those actually as emerging from a huge team effort, would you actually see a very different profile than the one that you got?
Okay, there are so it's a valid question in terms of whether the authorship itself is the best measure of the collaborative nature of the work that came before that. And of course, the norms in authorships have changed. However, why I think this measure itself is good, because I'm not looking at the single author papers in the 60s. So I'm, like in 2010, I'm looking at what were the single author papers and how much cognitive territory they covered when I normalized for the number. So actually, the single author papers in astronomy are just a fraction. I mean, it's just a few %. And yet, they cover more territory than these others. I'm not saying that that's the best quality of the work or that they're producing, but it tells us something about the diversity, the intellectual diversity of the field, and who actually brings most diversity to the field. But of course, the problem is when you use authorship as a measure, any sort of measure of that.
Right. So again, it's not, so the question of who brings most, if those single authors are actually also on big team projects.
That may be.
They're diverse theorizing, then we have an argument to say that we should actually continue putting resources in this big team stuff, because it's leading to that kind of individual theorizing as well.
Yeah, I mean, then one can actually look at the whole over of these people and say, do they mostly publish? Do they ever publish as parts of these big teams or not? And one can then make this argument that there are individuals stemming out of those, or maybe this is a separate subset of individuals. So yes, one would need to look more deeply into the actual practices of individual authors and how far they go in terms of their own teams. What is their own diversity across? But no, it would be fascinating actually to look at, yeah.